the Hartwell Gallery, had a way of making guests hold their breath. It was the fault of the skylight, perhaps, and the city dusk that washed itself thin upon the glass before consenting to enter, or the fault of Lady Honoria Vy's taste for pale walls and polished restraint. She liked her canvases to glow as if in confidence. On this evening, she had encircled them with people whom society was disposed to admire, and, as if that were not sufficient, she had signed the invitations in a hand as delicate and invulnerable as a lily stem. A small reception to mark the engagement of Miss Celia Harcourt and Mr. Oliver Rathbone. An unveiling, RSVP. The veil in question was a gauze drop pinned over a new portrait at the far end of the principal room. A silk cord fell from it like an idle serpent, looped and re-looped by Pritchard the butler, whose hands were the quietest thing about him. He moved through the guests with a judicious neglect to be noticed, which is the way with superior servants and successful crimes. "Pritchard never rushes," remarked Theo Drake to no one in particular. Theo wrote a column called Ears and Eyeglass for a paper that liked to think itself above malice. It's an axiom. If Pritchard hurries, leave. "Do try not to be oracular in my hearing," said Lady Honoria. She arranged her bracelets as if they had opinions. "It encourages you." Celia Harcourt, who would become a baronet's wife before the summer ended if calendars behaved, stood in the mild center of admiration, with her head at that studied angle actresses affect to hear precisely the right compliments and none of the others. She had one of those faces that are most beautiful when they are not examining themselves, and tonight it flickered between the two states with the uncertainty of a candle in a hall. Oliver Rathbone, good-tempered, quite handsome, slightly too pleased with the weight of his future, stood beside her and tried to look deserving rather than fortunate. "You mustn't be made to tire of yourself before supper," said Mrs. Greeley, Celia's aunt, who had made a success of disapproving the theatre without ever missing a performance. "Smile, but not too much. Remember that happiness grows vulgar when it is too bright." "I'll be economical," Celia murmured. She had a way with murmurs. "Oliver, do you think we could, just a few minutes in the small room?" "Lady Honoria will sound the trump at 8, Oliver said, glancing at the gauze. "After that, we shall be ours to ourselves." "There are advantages to your breed," observed Sebastian Vale, who was always allowed in. He directed plays with a success founded on listening to actors, and not to authors, and he had once listened to Celia too much. One is never one's own property for long. "Sebastian," said Lady Honoria pointedly, "do find a position from which you are not speaking." General Harcourt, Celia's father, planted himself by the mantel and looked as if he were guarding a bridge. In his generation he had learned to distrust velvet seats and professional charm. He nodded to old friends and marked the new ones by watching where they looked first. His daughter's fiancé he approved moderately. Lawyers kept the worst of life off the lawn. The director he did not approve at all and thought it would be tedious to conceal the fact. The scent in the room, white flowers inevitably, was the stephanotis Oliver's mother had insisted upon. "For luck," she said, and Isla Mowbray, a cousin who was to be the prettiest of bridesmaids, sneezed delicately into a lace handkerchief and looked guilty, as if bad luck were her idea. "Someone sent orange blossom," Miss Lyle reported to Lady Honoria, in a composed whisper. She was Lady Honoria's secretary, which meant she ran the house in the manner of a wind with good manners. "No card, except for the morning. I've set it in water." "Not in here," Lady Honoria said. "It ruins the eyes in portraits." On the sideboard, Pritchard had set out champagne with an accuracy that suggested both custom and conscience. He did things as they ought to be done and therefore did not forgive deviations. He watched, without appearing to, as Celia allowed a flute to be placed in her hand. She lifted it as an actress lifts an unwanted prop, and, after an instant, set it behind a screen of white roses. "She never drinks before a curtain," Sebastian said to Theo, as if Theo had asked. even if the curtain is only gauze. Your knowledge is unnerving, Theo replied, and made a small note in his head. There were, besides, the smaller authorities of habit and object. The glass case of Victorian scent bottles Lady Honoria had begun to collect when a duke told her he preferred women who smelled of nothing. The guest book on its stand with a fountain pen that bled the faintest green. The bell pull by the far door that no one used anymore, and, on Pritchard's watch chain, the onyx fob that meant the keys to the cabinets were under discipline. Miss Lyle had dusted earlier in the day and returned the key with her customary precision. Pritchard had noticed, as he always did. "Shall we, then?" Lady Honoria said. She stood before the veiled portrait with the poise of someone conducting both art and traffic. Celia and Oliver advanced. A small drift of silence pushed the noise into corners. The silk cord gave at Lady Honoria's light touch. Gauze slid away with a hiss like a discreet breath taken through teeth. The portrait looked out at them. There was nothing wrong with it. Sir Adrian Fulk had painted what he was paid to see, which in his case meant more truth than gratitude. Celia was herself, and something else besides. Something intent. A thought held too long, the line of the mouth less soft than one would tell it. On the table beside her hand, the painter had placed a spray of unblown orange, blossom. The choice was conventional. The suggestion was not. "It's very fine," Oliver said, gallant and startled. "It's like her," said Sebastian quietly, and then, because that might sound like praise, he added, "if you are fond of accuracy." General Harcourt's jaw moved once, as if testing a bit. Celia, looking at herself, did not smile and did not frown. She took a breath you could hear if you were near, and Lady Honoria, who was, heard it. "It is kind of Sir Adrian to take trouble," she said at last. "You see me rather naked." "Nakedness is the point," murmured Theo to his notebook. "Of art, of course," Lady Honoria said, brightly sufficient. "Do have some champagne." Later, no one would agree about the moment when the evening altered. Some said it was then, under the skylight, with the orange blossom still tight in its promise and the portrait acquiring its first opinions. Others placed it in a draught by the bell pull, where the air moved as if a door had been opened and closed again, very gently, by someone who knew the house. Dinner at Thornfield was conducted with the gentle exactitude that had been its hallmark since Sir Charles's grandfather had first installed the French mirrors and the long table of walnut. Silver gleamed under shaded candles. The flowers, white and green, gave off a faint, clean scent. The conversation moved at an even pace, largely in the hands of Lady Margaret, who arranged topics as deftly as she arranged seating. There was, as there must be on such evenings, a toast. It was Captain Hartwell who rose with a modest clink of glass against glass. He was not a florid speaker, but his words had precisely the right mixture of good sense and grace. He thanked the Thornfields for their kindness, praised English Springs for their refusal to be theatrical, and spoke of tomorrow with a soldier's tempered optimism. "We live by our orders," he said with a smile that included Vivien, "and by our promises." It was properly received, and Miss Pemberton, transferred to the small piano in the dining room for that very purpose, played them obligingly into coffee. Afterwards, the ladies drifted to the drawing-room. The men, in a less vigorous imitation of an older custom, consented to a brief interval with port in the library before joining them. Sir Charles, who disliked cigars after 7, declined even a sip and spoke instead to Dr. Whitmore about a local subscription for the church roof. Captain Hartwell accepted a small glass from the cut crystal decanter, and then, at a discreet murmur from Meadows, excused himself. There was, the butler conveyed without discernible inflection, a telephone call in the study. Whitehall, possibly, or the regiment. Captain Hartwell set down the glass with an apologetic glance and slipped away. In the drawing-room, Miss Pemberton had returned to Chopin, which served as a silken screen behind which conversation could continue unstrained. Vivien, near the fire with her mother, submitted to the gentle attentions of Mrs. Pemberton, who wished to rehearse the order of carriages. Diana worked at her needle, though less fiercely now, and once looked up as if the quality of the air had altered. She listened for something, a footfall perhaps, or a voice, and when nothing came, she lowered her gaze again. Time passed in the civilized manner, unnoticed until it had arranged itself. Sir Charles came in, as did Dr. Whitmore. Somewhere, a discreet gong acknowledged the moment when guests might, without incivility, begin to think of their rooms. Lady Margaret, with the instinct born of long practice, sent Meadows to see whether Captain Hartwell had been detained. Meadows did not return as quickly as one expects a man of his efficiency to return. When he did, he spoke first to Lady Margaret, very quietly. A small change took place in her face, like a shadow briefly crossing a calm pool. "Sir Charles," she said, equally quietly, "would you be so good?" There was nothing in her tone to alarm a roomful of people trained to find all calmness reassuring. Even so, Diana had risen, her needle fallen to the carpet unnoticed. Vivien, too, half rose and then sat again in obedience to some inner discipline. In the passage the air felt cooler. The study door was shut. "He did not answer when I knocked, madam," Meadows said. "The door is locked from within." Sir Charles frowned. "The key?" "Gone, sir." Sir Charles produced from his pocket the small skeleton key that had saved a dozen domestic contretemps. It turned with a reluctant click. Meadows stood aside. Sir Charles pushed the door open. The single lamp on the desk made a circle of honeyed light. Within it, Captain Hartwell sat very straight at first glance, as though intent upon his writing. Then one saw that his head had slipped a fraction to the side and come to rest upon the crook of his arm, near the blotter. The page beneath his hand bore a few lines of even script. His other hand lay open on the desk, palm up, the fingers faintly curved as if to receive some small object that had been forgotten. Nothing in the room gave the smallest impression of struggle. The curtains were slightly stirred by a draught from a window open no more than a finger's breadth. On the polished wood, near his right hand, stood a glass with a residue that caught the lamplight and made a garnet ring on the blotter. A second, paler ring, water perhaps, showed faintly on the wood a little further away. On the carpet just beneath the chair lay a leaf of something glossy and dark, like myrtle. Sir Charles made a small sound that was not quite speech. Lady Margaret, who had come as far as the threshold and no further, held the edge of the door with one hand and was very still. It was Dr. Whitmore who moved forward. He had performed 100 pastoral offices and was not unaccustomed to being useful. He touched the wrist lightly, then the throat. He looked up. In his face there was an old sadness and a new formality. "I'm afraid," he said, and his voice was simple, "that Captain Hartwell is dead." The word did not run about the house. It settled. Meadows, whose expression did not change, reached quietly for the bell to summon a footman, then thought better of it. Lady Margaret inclined her head once. Vivien had not come into the room. She stood very straight in the passage, and though no color left her face, something of youth did. "Doctor," Sir Charles said, finding a voice that did not quite belong to him, "will you—" "Yes," Dr. Whitmore replied. "I will telephone Dr. Fielding." He paused. "And the police." "Of course," Lady Margaret said. "At once." In the lamplight, the neat lines on the page under Captain Hartwell's hand were smudged where his sleeve had moved across them. The pen lay askew on the blotter, its nib bright and clean, as if it had concluded its duty without flourish. Outside, very far away, the peacock cried again, the sound oddly like something falling. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Thornfield Manor shortly before midnight, the car's lamps glancing across wet gravel and box hedges clipped with monastic precision. The house presented a disciplined facade. many windows dark, a few still throwing measured lamplight onto the terrace, as if propriety itself remained wakeful. A constable at the front steps straightened, and the butler, Meadows, materialized with that particular serenity superior servants bring to calamity. "Inspector," Meadows murmured, "Sir Charles asked me to receive you at once." Alleyn removed his hat in the hall and took in the faintly ecclesiastical hush of polished oak, portraits, and floral arrangements composed with a gardener's knowledge and a hostess's eye. The scent, an admixture of beeswax and something delicate and lemony, carried the ghost of an ordinary evening. He set that against the hour and the summoned doctor and thought with quiet regret that ordinary evenings resist such late recollections. He was shown to the library. Fox, solid and unhurried, was already there, his notebook closed, his gaze taking the long measure of the room. Dr. Morrison, the village physician, stood by the hearth with a composed, unhappy expression. Sir Charles and Lady Thornfield waited together near the door, the former's hands clasped behind him with military stiffness, the latter's face invested with the calm of a woman to whom composure is both duty and shield. Alleyn gave the smallest of bows. "Lady Thornfield, Sir Charles, I'm sorry." He crossed to the armchair by the French doors. The young woman sat as they had said she had been found, head resting against the wing, the open book in her lap, the fine features already settling into a peace that was not sleep. The lamplight softened and betrayed. On the small table, a single cup and saucer, a teaspoon placed, with unintended exactitude, and the faintest trace of lipstick on the porcelain rim. More a suggestion than a stain. Alleyn inclined his head, and the almond note made itself known, delicate but decisive, threaded queerly with jasmine from the conservatory beyond the glass. He lifted the book with care. Keats. The leaves had been ruffled by a draught, and the open page did not appear chosen. A narrow bookmark, hand-embroidered with the initial D, marked an earlier chapter. He replaced it as he had found it, and stood looking unhurriedly around him, taking in the small histories rooms tell to those who do not press them. The compact ash scattered in the cold grate, though no one had smoked tonight. A glass-fronted case with a faint smear on its brass catch. The French doors open a fraction, their latch imperfectly engaged. "Doctor," Alleyn said, almost conversationally. Dr. Morrison explained what little he was ready to say. "Rapid. The signs point as you will expect. I should prefer to avoid definitive language without analysis." "Quite." Alleyn's gaze returned to the table. There was no tray, no kettle, merely the cup and saucer, the teaspoon, and a napkin folded once, precisely. "Was Miss Thornfield in the habit of taking tea here, at this hour?" Lady Thornfield answered with that careful clarity that comes of a lifetime of arrangement. "Diana would sometimes bring a cup from the drawing-room. She found the library restful, the conservatory too, if the night was mild. And this evening, we were all in the drawing-room after dinner. Diana went to the library for a book. I did not observe her take a cup with her at that moment." Meadows, respectful, filled the little pause. "I carried away the tray at 11, Inspector. There were cups then still in use in the drawing-room. Miss Diana had left earlier." Alleyn nodded, as if it were all in order. "And the doors?" "Closed, sir," the butler replied. "I found them as you see when I made my rounds." Fox, with his unobtrusive patience, drifted to the French doors and put his hand lightly to the latch. It teetered, then set with a click. He did not look at Alleyn, and Alleyn did not need him to. He noted, additionally, a faint outline where a glass had been set, then removed, the ring of evaporation on polished wood that housemaids wage war against. The ring lay some inches from the cup. It might be nothing. Most things were, until they were not. He turned to the assembled. "You have been very good to wait." He let his eyes rest momentarily on each face, the graying father with his martial self-command. the elegant mother whose grief took the form of making matters easy for others, the village doctor, and Meadows, whose very stillness suggested a mind-measuring household sequences. "Mrs. Vivien Hartwell?" he asked presently. "In her room," Lady Thornfield said. "Captain Hartwell is with Sir Charles's cousin in the morning. Room. Then perhaps, after Dr. Morrison has made his necessary arrangements, we might sit somewhere quiet and go over the order of the evening. There is no great hurry." It was not, strictly speaking, true. But there were truths one did not speak in old houses at midnight. He directed a last look at the cup, the lips shadow against white. At the napkin's single fold, one might have expected two, and at the book with its small insistence upon being open where it had not been. Beyond the glass, a slow white bloom in the conservatory offered its sweetness to no one in particular. "Fox," he said, "you'll see that the doors are kept shut and the room secure. If we could also learn who arranged the flowers in the drawing-room and at what hour the conservatory was last watered, thank you." He turned back to Lady Thornfield. "A tiresome business for you, and at a bad time. I will try to be brief." She inclined her head. "We are in your hands, Inspector." It was not precisely true either. He was, as ever, in the hands of human habit, rituals of household, the silent traffic of cups and keys, the private arrangements of sentiment. He felt, as he often did at the threshold of such inquiries, the almost audible settling of the house around him, as if Thornfield Manor itself had decided to watch what he would make of its order. Alleyn preferred a small room for talk. Thornfield's morning room, with its writing table placed squarely between windows and a modest fire that behaved as decorously as the rest of the house, suited him. Fox, with a notebook whose very plainness was a comfort, remained unobtrusively at hand. Meadows admitted their first visitor and withdrew without rustle. Vivien entered as if stepping into cool water. She wore a simple wool dress, unadorned save for a narrow ribbon at the throat. Its severity lent her beauty, an air of duty assumed. She took the chair offered and, after a fractional pause, folded her hands. "You must find this all rather dreadful," she said, and the formality of it seemed an attempt to contain something unruly. "It is worse for those to whom it has happened," Alleyn replied. "I'm grateful you will help me fix a picture of last evening. Miss Thornfield left the drawing-room at about 10:30. "Yes, she said she wanted Keats. She had always liked the odes in difficult moods." Vivien's gaze moved to the orderly stack of correspondence on the writing table, as if preferring any set of facts to the one presently in question. "We had coffee. Diana took none then. I did see her look toward the conservatory when Miss Pemberton began to play that little sonata. She disliked music when restless. And her restlessness, how would you describe it?" "Not temper," Vivien said carefully. "Suppressed energy, a view fixed inward. She had been unsettled by recent changes." Her engagement. Vivien's hands tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, she returned Mr. Ashford his ring last week. It was not—" She checked herself. "It did not suit, after all. We spoke of it only in the form allowed." "You did not follow her to the library?" "No." Aunt Margaret began the coffee. "Captain Hartwell asked after arrangements for today." The word came and went with a tiny shiver. "I last saw Diana pass the stairs. She did not carry a cup." Alleyn allowed a small nod to indicate he would not press the matter further. "And your own movement after 10:30? "I remained in the drawing-room. Miss Pemberton played. Captain Hartwell, Sir Charles, Dr. Whitmore, and Mr. Fielding— it was he who stayed over for the wedding— talked near the hearth. I went up at 11. I had a headache and thought sleep would be wise. Meadows came to me shortly after." She stopped. "I'm sorry." "You have been entirely clear, Miss Thornfield." "Thank you." When Vivien had gone, Captain Hartwell arrived with the brisk self-control of a man who has trained himself to present things in good order. He wore civilian tweeds but carried the ghost of uniform in his carriage. "Bad business, Alleyn," he began, with a glance that sought to make of them two men who understood one another. Bad for them, and, one cannot help seeing, very unfortunate timing. "Time will do what it must," Alleyn said. "May I trouble you with detail? You spoke with Miss Thornfield at any point yesterday evening?" "In passing. We exchanged 2 sentences about the conservatory. She admired an orchid. I told her it would open by morning." The faintest smile flickered and was suppressed as indecent. "We had no confidences. You remained in the drawing room from coffee until Meadows' discovery?" "More or less. Sir Charles and I went to the billiard room for a quarter of an hour after 10:45. Post-prandial ritual, cue ball, and a single frame. Dr. Whitmore joined us, then excused himself to write something in the vestry book he'd brought, of all things. We returned at 11:10. Miss Pemberton was still playing. I saw Lady Thornfield send Meadows on his rounds. That is all." "You did not go near the library or conservatory?" "No, a beat. I know the latch on the conservatory door is perverse. It has a trick from years of sun. Sir Charles curses it, but I didn't try it last night, if that is your concern." Alleyn accepted the information without embroidery. "Did you observe Miss Diana take a cup from the drawing-room?" "Cannot say that I did." Hartwell's voice remained easy, but his eyes made one brief patrol of the room that said practice had taught him to watch for the unexpected. "She was a proud girl, Inspector. Too proud for, well, you will discover what you need." Sir Charles and Lady Thornfield came together. It was a small act of defiance against circumstance, the house's master and mistress, presenting a united, understated fortitude. Alleyn stood as they entered and remained standing until Lady Thornfield had taken her seat. "We will be very plain, Inspector," she said. "We conducted the evening as we would any other. It appears that our ordinary habits, our rituals, I should say, have become relevant." "Rituals often are," Alleyn murmured. "You pour?" "Always." "The coffee is mine after dinner. The tea at 9:30 for anyone who wishes it is Meadows' province. The cups are kept in the china pantry. The Severus set is reserved for evenings. I poured coffee. Meadows poured tea at the side table. The guests served themselves." "Did anyone carry a cup out?" Lady Thornfield looked to Sir Charles, who cleared his throat. "I saw Miss Pemberton take tea to the piano. The Reverend carried his to the mantel and left it there, I think. Diana had none at that moment. Later," he hesitated. "Later I was in billiards with Hartwell. I cannot account for the interval." "Dr. Whitmore?" Alleyn asked when the clergyman joined them. He was grave without display, a man rehearsed in the accommodations of loss. "I watched Miss Pemberton's hands," he said simply. "They are capable. I heard the French clock strike 11. At some point thereafter, Lady Thornfield asked Meadows to see to the doors. I went to the writing desk to make a note. Tomorrow's lesson. It is my habit to write down the sermon's brief and let it cool overnight." He smiled almost apologetically. "I'm of no use beyond that." "On the contrary," Alleyn said. "You have given me an hour's shape." At the door, Meadows reappeared, a discreet presence shadowed by the housekeeper's sensible shoes on polished boards. Something in the butler's stillness, no more than the way his eye passed over the Sèvres cup that had been brought in for demonstration and went quite carefully away again, registered with Alleyn as the slightest asymmetry in an otherwise ordered room. "Thank you," he said to Sir Charles and Lady Thornfield. "If I may, I should like next to speak with your staff." Alleyn preferred to cross the threshold that divides family from staff with the same unhurried courtesy he brought to drawing rooms. Meadows received the request for interviews without visible surprise and conducted him down the side passage to the small sitting room reserved for the upper servants, where a pot of strong tea stood ready as if the house itself anticipated the inspector's needs. Meadows himself came first, by tacit agreement, the keystone of any household account. He stood straight, hands composed against the crease of his trousers, and answered with that precise economy which is the butler's craft. "The coffee was served in the drawing-room by her ladyship," he said. "Tea at the side table, sir. The Sèvres was used, yes. Miss Diana excused herself at 10:25 by the French clock. And the pantry?" Alleyn's tone was conversational. "I am told Miss Diana sometimes preferred to prepare her own." Meadows allowed a fractional pause. "Miss Diana found the ritual calming, sir. She was not interfered with." Another pause, nearly imperceptible. "The small pantry adjoins the library corridor. It is kept in readiness. Kettle simmering, caddy, sugar, and a carafe of orgeat for those ladies who take a sweetening without spirits. It is not commonly employed late, but not unknown. Last night, I attended the drawing-room almost continuously until I was called to secure the doors," Meadows replied. "When I passed the pantry before that duty, 10 minutes to the hour, it had the appearance of recent use. The kettle lid had been set askew." "By whom?" "It would not be my place to suppose, sir." The words were simple. The silence that followed them carried the weight of a knowledge mastered rather than shared. Alleyn inclined his head, as if acknowledging a move in a game neither wished to name. Mrs. Fairchild, the housekeeper, came next. A dignified woman of 50 with a chain of polished keys at her waist and a gaze that suggested a long practice in keeping order where emotion might otherwise prevail. She recited inventories with calm authority, and when Alleyn inquired about essences or household preparations, her replies possessed the firmness of principle. "We do not keep bitter almond in my cupboards, Inspector. Lady Thornfield forbade it years ago after a child's governess read a piece in the Queen about unwholesome flavourings. The cook has sweet almond for pastry, quite harmless, and orange flower water for trifles. Laurel water is not held. We scent linen with lavender. If prussic acid is present on the premises, it would be in the gardener's shed for pests, and I have been assured it is not. Keys, Mrs. Fairchild. Mine remain on my person. Lady Thornfield keeps her own small keys in her escritoire. No bottle leaves my charge without my knowing it." The parlour-maid, Alice, entered with red-rimmed eyes and the determination not to weep. She folded her hands tightly and answered in a quick, respectful whisper that made the words seem to hurry past their meanings. "I took in a fresh plate of biscuits at 10:15, sir. Miss Diana was still there then. She smiled, sort of, at me and said she would find her book. I left the tray by the screen. Later I went to draw the curtains on the staircase landing and I thought I saw someone in the conservatory, just beyond the glass. Only a shape, sir, so it might have been the plants and the lamps, and me with the lights behind." She hesitated and flushed. "I don't say what I can't swear to." "Quite right," Alleyn said softly. "And the pantry?" "I saw the door stand open a crack when I went by to the linen press. I didn't go in. It isn't my place." The second footman, Thomas, was a sleek young man whose self-respect derived in equal measure from his livery and Meadows' approval. He proved exact on times and dutifully hazy where the line of discretion ran close. "Dr. Whitmore asked me to fetch the vicarage writing case after the alarm, sir. Before that, I took cigars to Sir Charles at 10:20 and carried away the empty coffee cups near past. I wiped the brass catch of the library bookcase yesterday afternoon with a metal polish, sir, like I always do Thursday. That's why I noticed the little smear this morning that wasn't properly rubbed out." Thomas looked distressed at the lapse. It gave me a turn. "Who handled the catch last night?" "I couldn't say, sir." He stared at the tea tray. "We don't generally open that case in the evening." Cook, Mrs. Preece, came with clean hands and a guarded expression that suggested kitchens, unlike drawing-rooms, admitted little nonsense. "I sent up the orgeat in the cut glass with the mother-of-pearl stopper because Mrs. Pemberton asked for it the other day, and her ladyship had it moved convenient," she reported. "It lives on the top shelf in the pantry, where it's no trouble to reach. Gentlemen don't take to it. It was in its place when I left the servants' hall at 10. A brief, defiant glance. I don't favor almond this and almond that. Makes people fanciful. The head gardener, Mr. Pell, proved a taciturn man who had given his allegiance to orchids and found human conversation inferior. His cap remained in his hands while he spoke of vents and misters as if they were old friends. Doors from the library are sound if you set the latch proper, sir. I showed Miss Diana the trick of it. She was fond of sitting by evenings. I uses no poisons, as you'd call 'em. Soft soap, quassia, nicotine wash. Fumigations done by professionals with their drums and masks. We had none of that. He lifted his eyes once. There was a saucer knocked off one stand this morning. Could have been the cat. Alleyn thanked each, with the peculiar civility that both reassures and unsettles, the tone of a man who misses little and presses less. On his way back along the corridor, he paused at the pantry itself, permitting his eye to linger on the simple altar of domestic ritual. The canister with its lid set slightly awry, the sugar bowl with the tongs lying at right angles rather than lengthwise, the kettle trivet glossy with repeated use. On the top shelf, the cut-glass decanter of orgeat stood in a square of duller dust. Its base had been returned a fraction to the left, as if a careful hand had replaced it while listening for a sound beyond the door. Meadows, summoned by no word, had appeared at the far end of the passage. Alleyn did not turn. He allowed his hand to rest against the pantry's cool wood, feeling the house's breath move through it as wind moves through reeds. "You have kept a very good house, Meadows," he said. "Thank you, sir. And last night, nothing was amiss?" A beat, then, "Nothing that could not be set right in the morning, Inspector." It was an answer both correct and untrue, and it carried them, as such answers do, to the very edge of something that would not yet be named. After the measured reticence of the servants' hall, Alleyn returned to the library with the unhurried tread of a man who trusted ordinary habits to disclose extraordinary truths. Morning had settled to a steady rain, drawing a sheen across the terrace stones and laying a damp gloss upon the conservatory glass. The room retained its curious peace. Diana's chair, the open Keats, the cup. Familiar objects in their accustomed places, except that everything about them now had the distinctness of a memory sharpened by loss. He stood a moment, allowing the room's arrangement to speak. Ritual, in a house like this, was the net that caught trifles, where a spoon lay, how a door was closed, which cup was used when solitude was required. He had found, over years in drawing rooms and kitchens, that murder rarely disturbed the grand pattern. It nudged a habit minutely askew. He bent to the Sèvres cup. Fox, who had stationed himself at the threshold, watched the inspector's gaze move over porcelain and saucer as if reading text. The lipstick trace was a mere whisper, no thick smear, but the faintest crescent. On the saucer, almost apologetically placed, lay a lemon pip, flattened to the porcelain as if pressed there by a damp finger. The teaspoon rested precisely against the left-hand side of the saucer, its bowl towards the drinker. Alleyn did not touch it. He looked instead to the side table and the faint circular evaporation mark he had noticed earlier. Morning had emphasized it, a paler ring against the polished surface, not of a cup but of something smaller, sharper in its edge. Perhaps a little glass or a narrow bottle. He examined the table's center, where a lace mat described Meadows's sense of order, and saw that the ring lay just outside this domestic continent, as if made by a hand that did not, as a rule, live with such niceties. He straightened. "Fox, would you ask Meadows to bring the lemon fork and sugar tongs from last night's tray? And then Mrs. Pembroke. I should like to see the small pantry." The pantry, when Mrs. Pembroke led them to it, revealed itself as a diminutive sanctuary of porcelain and tin, its shelves bearing neat ranks of cups, a blue and white teapot, and 2 small caddies, one for the family's China tea, one for Indian. A spirit lamp stood on a marble-topped table, its wick trimmed to exactness, a little kettle beside it with a patina earned by years of careful use. Even here, order reigned, the kind of order that moved invisibly about a house and kept its anxieties soothed. "I tidied before dinner," Mrs. Pembroke said, with professional pride that had weathered shock. "Miss Diana would sometimes make a tisane if she was nervous." "In which case," Alleyn said very mildly, "she would take one of these, her particular cups." The housekeeper hesitated. "Yes, sir, the thin ones. They're lighter in the hand." She touched a row of delicate cups. One space, not quite aligned with its fellows, showed where a cup had been returned slightly off the mark. Set minutely deeper on the shelf, the handle facing inward rather than out. Alleyn's eyes rested there. "You said last night something had been washed and put back not quite as you would have arranged it." "That would be it, sir." The sink, a tidy white porcelain rectangle with a brass waist, showed no visible stain, but when Alleyn leaned close, an intangible sweetness drew forward, as insubstantial as memory, and yet distinct amid soap and starch. That suggestion of almonds that had hovered like an accusation since they entered the house. He took out his handkerchief, dampened a corner, and touched the rim of the waist. When he brought it to his face, the faintest echo of the scent clung to the linen. Meadows arrived with the lemon fork and sugar tongs on a small tray, placed them with the respect one offers to a sacrament, and waited. The lemon fork, wiped and polished, bore no betrayal. The tongs, however, presented a peculiarity. One limb showed a dullness where polish had not reached the hinge. Between the tines, a minute crust of sugar had lodged. No more than a glint, but on its surface, when Alleyn held it to the light, a perfect pinprick made a dark center. "Do you put out lumps or loose sugar, Mr. Meadows?" Alleyn asked. "Lumps, sir. Most of our guests prefer them. The family generally take none." "Miss Diana?" "Rarely, sir. Never in the evening, to my recollection." Alleyn inclined his head. "Thank you." The conservatory exhaled its familiar breath of earth and blossom when they stepped through the French doors. Moisture beaded the splintered ledges, and from somewhere deep among the leaves came the slow drip of condensing rain. On the left, near the door, a tub held a glossy-leaved shrub the color of bottle glass. Old Timothy's careful labels named plants with foreign courtesy: citrus, orchids, azaleas, and, here, Prunus laurocerasus. Some of its leaves showed fresh cuts, the stalks exuding a green dampness. On a nearby slate shelf was a small glass measure, the kind a house might use for scent or medicine, rinsed and left to drain, its meniscus mark still visible inside the bowl. Alleyn lifted it by the rim with his handkerchief. He did not bring it to his face, he merely registered it and placed it back. He preferred the conservatory, as Diana, perhaps, had taken it, a refuge of perfumes. The laurel's quiet presence took its place among them without emphasis. On their way back, he paused at the library threshold. The French doors stood as they had, one margin imperfectly aligned, as if a hand had pressed rather than turned the temperamental latch. He touched the brass, seeing there the faintest new scratches running downward, parallel, a signet perhaps, or the bezel of a ring skidding when a hurried hand had tried to quiet noise. "Meadows," he said, when they were again in the room, "last night when you laid the tea, how did you set the spoons?" "On the right, sir, bowl inward. Her ladyship prefers it. We observe the same in all rooms." "And this cup," Alleyn indicated the saver, "has its spoon to the left." Meadows glanced at it, then away. "Yes, sir." "Curious, isn't it?" Alleyn murmured, more to himself than to the others. "How a house keeps to its habits, even in distress. And how, when a habit is broken, one does not always see it at once." He did not pursue the matter. The room, with its faint ring, its lemon pip, its left-lying spoon, had told him more than anyone would yet say. He stood, looking past the French doors to the blurred garden, and allowed the elements of household routine to resettle in his mind. Outside, the rain deepened. Within, the silence became almost companionable. It was Fox who broke it. "Sir?" "Nothing immediate," Alleyn said. "Only that we should be ready for the day to move again." For it was his experience that when a house has held its breath long enough, something in it gives, a letter found where it should not be, a person who fails to appear, a small collapse permitted at last by manners that cannot be maintained forever. He thought of the tub of laurel by the door, the faint sweetness in the pantry, the spoon set against the left-hand side. The next movement, when it came, would be quiet. He felt it already, somewhere in the rooms beyond, gathering itself with the patience that polite houses demand. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned to a gauze through which the lawns took on that peculiar sheen of English green, richer for suffering. The house, having borne grief all day with correct decorum, had reached a pitch of quiet from which every small sound detached itself. Footsteps in the passage, the delicate tap of porcelain, the faint rattle of a sash unsettled by damp. It was at such an hour that Meadows brought in the delayed post upon a lacquered tray, his movements measured, his face composed to the expression that had seen Thornfield through births, funerals, and a war that seemed not yet entirely concluded. He placed the letters on the writing table beside Lady Thornfield with a slight inclination that admitted significance without presuming upon it. "There is one, my lady," he said, "which was returned by the post office. I thought it best to bring it at once." The envelope lay upon the others with that quiet authority that sometimes attends paper. Its cream had been scrolled by the hand of the postal clerk, insufficient postage, and then redirected to Thornfield. The address, in a fine feminine hand, read, "Mr. Henry Ashford, 12 Kingsmere Terrace, Bayswater." Lady Thornfield's fingers, unshaken until now, hovered a fraction above the paper before she drew back. "Inspector," she said, her voice scarcely above the kind of whisper that might be used in a sick room. "Perhaps—" Alleyn inclined his head. "With your permission." The flap had not been sealed cleanly, and the returned letter yielded its contents with the quiet inevitability of things that wished to be read. The note within bore the Thornfield crest and that slightly floral scent that civilized households stamp upon their stationery. The writing, poised and unmistakably feminine, occupied but a few lines. "Henry, do not come to Thornfield again. I have chosen what must be done. You will understand when you hear. It is kinder. D. No date, no salutation beyond the Christian name. No ornament." The sentences, even in their brevity, seemed oddly clipped, as if restraint had been superimposed upon a hand more accustomed to flourish. Alleyn glanced once at the paper's watermark, a discreet London stationer known for supplying county houses, and again at the ink, which tended to violet rather than the iron blue he had seen upon a small list of books in the library written, Dr. Whitmore had told him, in Diana's hand. "It was posted yesterday evening," he asked, turning the envelope to examine the cancellation mark. "The village has an early collection and one at 7, Meadows replied with careful precision. "Peters took a packet to the box at 6:30 by my instruction. Miss Diana gave him a letter at the side door. He mentioned it to me because her hands were without gloves and the rain had begun." "Thank you, Meadows." Silence settled again, but it had altered in character. Grief had acquired an attendant. Speculation, that indefatigable guest. Vivien, who had sat so still by the window that she might have been a study in composure, reached for the letter and, upon a slight movement from her mother, withdrew her hand without touching it. Her eyes, when at last they lifted to Alleyn's face, were clear and held nothing of the hysteria that letter-writing in certain moods can produce. "It sounds unlike her," she said. Diana favored exclamation marks. She was not kind to the English full stop. Sir Charles's hand closed very gently upon his wife's. "One cannot judge a child's last words," he murmured, but the words, in their quiet courtesy, carried no conviction. At that moment, the measured tread of a messenger crossed the tiles of the entrance hall. Meadows attended. His return was as discreet as all his comings and goings, but he held a flimsy slip that conferred upon him the blunt authority of news. "A telegram, sir, delivered from the station." He offered it to Sir Charles, who, after a fraction of hesitation, passed it to Alleyn. "Arriving 5:20. Train. Must see you. H. Ashford." The room seemed to adjust itself around the word. Arriving. It implied intrusion. Of past into present. Of private into formal. The name, already present upon the returned envelope, acquired weight by repetition. Lady Thornfield's hands, lying one upon the other, exerted the smallest pressure. Captain Hartwell, who had entered a moment earlier and stood behind Vivien's chair, permitted himself no movement beyond the stilling of the breath. "We shall receive Mr. Ashford properly, of course," Sir Charles said, almost to the room. "The circumstances are more properly within my province than yours at present," Alleyn suggested gently. "If I might propose that Sergeant Fox meet the train and ask Mr. Ashford to come directly here, it may spare him an encounter in the village that would serve no one." Lady Thornfield inclined her head, grateful for the shelter such formality provided. Fox, with his quiet tread and dog-eared notebook, withdrew to make the necessary arrangements. "Meadows," Alleyn said, when they were again in that finer register of quiet. "When you sorted the post, was there anything addressed to Captain Hartwell?" Meadows' composure acquired, if not weight, then something like density. "No, Inspector, nothing for the captain." Hartwell smiled, just enough to acknowledge the question without doing it the discourtesy of answer. "You cannot imagine, Inspector, how profoundly I hope Mr. Ashford may clarify matters that seem unhappily clouded." It was the kind of sentence that might have been meant one way and taken another. Vivien's eyes remained lowered. Dr. Whitmore, who had sat unnoticed in a corner, stirred and addressed no one in particular. The young are prone to finalities. We forget how quickly pain converts itself to resolution that seems at once courageous and— He did not finish the thought. Alleyn turned the letter over once more. There was, beneath the violet ink, a slight impression as though the hand had pressed through onto a missing sheet. He would ask Fox for the blotter in due course. For the moment, the returned note, by virtue of its very ambiguity, had opened a new passage in the house's silence. "Miss Thornfield," he said to Vivien, "when Mr. Ashford arrives, perhaps you would prefer to withdraw." She looked at him as if the question had intruded upon a narrow path she was navigating with careful steps. "I think it is best I remain," she said. "We shall have to speak sooner or later. Later, in my experience, seldom improves matters." The rain gave a last, delicate rattle on the panes and ceased. In the pause it left behind, the decision to invite the past up the drive and into the morning room took its place among the other quiet necessities of grief. Alleyn, who had learned to recognize the temper of such hours, stood, folded the returned letter, and returned it to its envelope. "Fox will bring Mr. Ashford directly," he said. "Until then, may I beg that nothing more be disturbed, and that this letter be kept safe." Meadows inclined his head. The room resumed its careful stillness, but not the same stillness as before. It had acquired that faint tremor one feels in air before thunder that never quite breaks, the tension that belongs to words withheld and decisions approached with a decorum that only barely contains them. Evening gathered slowly at Thornfield, as if reluctant to commit itself to darkness. The rain had thinned to a fine veil that drew a gentle gloss across the gravel sweep and laid a dim luster upon the yew hedges. Within, lamps were lit in measured sequence, the household's politeness arranging itself around calamity with the same grave decorum that set silver and crystal for dinner. Alleyn sat alone for a time in the small morning room, the returned letter spread before him. Fox had procured a magnifying glass from the library. With it he followed the hand as one follows a thought, measure by measure. Diana's script possessed grace without affectation, firm uprights, clean turns, a distinctive economy in her capitals. Yet here the flow had stiffened. A handful of phrases bore the faint rigidity of something learned by heart rather than felt. Knowledge that transforms affection into obligation. He had heard it before, among people who, faced with an awkward reality, converted it into a moral formulation suitable for drawing-room consumption. He turned the envelope. The village postmark gave a late afternoon hour. Fox's pencil note in the margin, obtained with the village postmistress's regretful precision, placed the letter in Diana's own hand at the counter shortly after 4. The telegram from Mr. Ashford, however, had been handed in near 6 by a messenger of no particular description, who declined to provide his name. The office girl remembered the envelope, silvered, thick, tied with a pale thread. Vague but suggestive. One did not trouble a village telegraph office with such paraphernalia unless one wished to be remembered for the wrong detail or, more cleverly, for a useless one. Fox came in, quiet as ever. Bayswater address doesn't exist, sir. The numbering ends a terrace sooner, and the handwriting on the telegram form, clerk says it was already written out when presented. Just so, Alleyn said, and Mr. Ashford proposes to arrive at 8:30. We are to receive a ghost. He replaced the glass and let his eyes rest on the dull shine of the writing table's blotter. A faint palimpsest, impressions of an earlier page, could just be traced in the right light. He tilted the blotter toward the lamp. Bays. Then a blurred wand of ink. Oblag. Another fragment. Enough to suggest that the phrases in the letter had been drafted here in the morning room and not at a lady's escritoire upstairs. Diana's. Possibly, but the strokes were heavier than her customary lightness. Someone had pressed too hard, betrayed by their own emphasis. The room's door stood ajar. In the strip of corridor visible beyond, Thornfield went on with its rituals. A footman carried a tray. Mrs. Pembroke crossed with an economy born of years, the faintest sound of a piano. Miss Pemberton, practicing scales to relieve agitation. Routine, like a patient old servant, did its best. He found himself thinking of the pantry's small disorder, the cup restored to the wrong place, the almond breath that had clung even after soap and water. One did not bruise cherry laurel leaves by accident, nor steep them without intention. The plant in the conservatory had told its story in the simplest possible way. Touched by a hasty hand, it had marked the occasion by dying a little. Which hand? Diana's would have known to avoid bruising. Habit teaches a certain tenderness. The fresh scratches upon the French door's latch suggested clumsiness, masked as familiarity. Someone who wished it believed that Diana had slipped easily in and out, had rehearsed the gesture, and, in rehearsing, marred the brass. Alleyn had seen such marks in other houses, small abrasions on the surface where a lie had been made to sit. The human arrangement moved in his mind with the same quiet inevitability. Lady Thornfield's resolve, touched by something like dread. Sir Charles's decency, narrowing into a wish not to see. Vivien's pride held at the cost of a tremor in the hand. Hartwell's courtesy, precise as parade, its very perfection an effort. Meadows' fidelity, rigidly fair, withholding nothing, and yet saying less than he knew. And Diana, a nature that reached for intensity, then recoiled from its consequences. She had written, or allowed something to be written for her. She had gone to her sanctuary. She had sat with Keats and a cup that was not hers. "Sir?" Fox's voice, respectful. "Shall I ask Meadows to retain all callers in the drawing-room when Mr. Ashford arrives? If you please, and a small favor at the telephone. Ask the Bayswater Exchange for any listing in the name Ashford that matches our hand. You will not find it, but the attempt is part of the figure." Fox nodded and withdrew. Alleyn stood and crossed to the window. The gravel, pearled with rain, had taken on that faintly luminous quality evening gives to pale surfaces. From somewhere distant, the motor of an approaching car, throttled down, made itself known as a subdued expectation. It would be a comfort to everyone if Mr. Ashford were to step from it with neat apologies and a nervous bouquet. Comfort, Alleyn reflected, is often an impostor. He let his thoughts settle like dust, light, almost invisible, but present on every surface. If Diana had threatened to speak, of what precisely remained only implied by her phrase about obligation, then others had felt it as pressure upon a delicate structure which could not bear strain. There are households in which love is indistinguishable from duty and duty from concealment. A single letter can turn that conversion the other way. Behind him, the clock on the mantel chimed the quarter. Civilly. Alleyn straightened the letter, returned it to its envelope, and placed it where its owner would have put it. Tidiness is a tribute to the dead, and a test for the living. Then he went out to meet the evening and the man who might be real, invented, or, most dangerous of all, both at once. Henry Ashford's arrival had none of the theatricality the household, subconsciously perhaps, had braced itself to withstand. The motor that brought him drew up with modest discretion. The young man who stepped into Meadows's efficient custody wore a rain-darkened overcoat and the sober expression of one who comprehends that the proper hour for indignation has passed, leaving only the obligation to be truthful. In the morning room, under the shaded lamps and the quiet governance of a small fire, Sir Charles and Lady Thornfield received him with grave civility. Vivien sat a little apart, her hands folded very precisely in her lap. Captain Hartwell stood by the mantel, his posture impeccable, the glint of lamplight on his signet ring neatly contained. "Mr. Ashford," Sir Charles said, "we are grateful for your promptness." "I came as soon as I received the wire," Ashford answered. His voice, clear and well-bred without being aristocratic, suggested education acquired through diligence rather than inheritance. He glanced once toward Vivien, then away again, as one acknowledges a pain without accepting its claim. "May I ask," Alleyn said with polite ease, "to which wire you refer?" "To the one from your sergeant, sir," Ashford replied. "Delivered to my rooms in Bloomsbury at noon." He produced the flimsy sheet. He asked me to attend, as there were questions concerning Miss Thornfield's death. He hesitated. "I should add, since I understand there was some expectation of me, that I sent no telegram of my own." Sir Charles exchanged the briefest look with Lady Thornfield. Captain Hartwell's gaze had gone to the fire, attentive without appearing to fix on anything. "There was a telegram," Alleyn said mildly, "announcing your intention to call this evening. It arrived here yesterday. You did not dispatch it." "No, Inspector." Ashford's brows drew together. "Nor have I ever lived in Bayswater, though a letter addressed there would not, of course, have reached me." Vivien made a tiny sound, not quite a word. She had not been told the address. Alleyn saw the knowledge bloom in her face and then, as swiftly, be mastered. "Will you sit, Mr. Ashford?" Alleyn indicated a chair. "We should be grateful for any clarification you can offer about your recent understanding with Miss Thornfield." Ashford obeyed, folding his damp gloves with care. "There is little to clarify that does not tread on private grief. Diana and I were—" He paused, and when he resumed, his voice had steadied into something properly restrained. "We were engaged. Some weeks ago, she asked to be released. She said there was a matter at Thornfield that altered everything. She would not tell me what it was. She begged me not to press her, and, to my shame, I did press, though gently. She said if I cared for her, I must not come down, must not write, and must trust that I would approve in time." Sir Charles's hand closed over the arm of his chair. Lady Thornfield's gaze held very straight on the young man's face. "Did she mention letters?" Alleyn asked. "She said only that certain things had been written which, if shown, would do harm. She meant to prevent it." The gloves twisted. He forced them straight. There was a note afterward in another hand. Anonymous, repeating that I must not try to see her. I ignored it. I wrote twice more. I had no reply. Your acquaintance with Captain Hartwell. Alleyn's tone retained its conversational quality. Ashford's glance flicked, quick and measuring, to the man at the mantel. We have met. He was perfectly civil. Hartwell offered a small, dry smile. I hope I was more than that. We discussed architecture, as I recall. And Miss Thornfield, Alleyn said. Hartwell's smile did not quite alter. It is possible we mentioned her. Only that, Alleyn asked gently. Only that. The evenness of Hartwell's tone suggested that a more forceful denial would be vulgar. There was a pause of that particular sort, which civilized people allow one another when a statement has been made that cannot be pursued without trespassing. The rain had ceased. In the silence, a log settled very softly, and the faintest scent of damp earth drifted through from the hall. Alleyn rose. Lady Thornfield, I think we have asked all that can reasonably be asked this evening in company. Mr. Ashford, I shall require a few minutes alone with you later. For the present, may I beg your patience? Meadows will see that you have whatever you need. He moved toward the door, then turned, his manner still the quintessence of courtesy. Captain Hartwell, if you could spare me 10 minutes in the conservatory. Hartwell inclined his head with unhurried compliance. Of course. They went by way of the library, where the air retained that faint, obstinate sweetness Alleyn no longer mistook. In the conservatory, the twilight lay like smoke among the leaves, and the white bells of laurel blossoms hung decorously, their innocence unaltered by knowledge. Alleyn did not look at them. He took his place by a wrought iron bench, his hands lightly joined behind him. You were good enough yesterday, he said, to mention the perversity of the French door latch. Hartwell's smile acknowledged the memory. An old house's trivialities. One learns them or stubs one's toe. One does, Alleyn agreed. You spoke with Miss Thornfield at those doors last night. I did. May I ask the tenor of that conversation? You may. Shall answer, however, that it was private. Hartwell's politeness had acquired a fine edge. I advised her to be prudent. In what regard? In the general regard in which young women sometimes require prudence. Alleyn's pause contained nothing pressing and everything else. You have served abroad, Captain. One picks up a miscellany of knowledge in such service. Botanical, for example. Hartwell's profile did not change. If you mean that I can distinguish a rose from a rhododendron, you do me too much credit. Cherry laurel is neither, Alleyn said, as if he made the observation for himself. It requires a certain definiteness of purpose to bruise its leaves just so. Hartwell looked at him then, quite directly. Are you proposing to me, Inspector, that an officer of His Majesty's army has been botanizing to deadly effect in a country house? I'm proposing nothing at all, Alleyn said gently. I'm listening to a house that has begun to speak. Hartwell's breath left him in something like a laugh, without amusement. Then perhaps you will tell me what it says. Only this, Alleyn replied. That habit is a more eloquent witness than any man, and that some habits, when artfully broken, are louder than cries. He let the words rest, like dust where they would settle. You will be at home in the morning, Captain. I shall, Hartwell said. I have nowhere else to be. Alleyn inclined his head and returned by the library. In the corridor beyond, he heard the low murmur of Meadows arranging an austere supper, the discreet sound of porcelain handled by hands that knew its history. The house had drawn itself together for the night, its composure recovered with effort. In the morning, that composure would be asked to bear one more thing. They gathered at Alleyn's quiet request, in the smaller drawing room that overlooked the south lawn. The rain had thinned to a pale gauze, and beyond the windows the green settled itself into repose, as if the landscape had decided, for decency's sake, to be still. Sir Charles stood with one hand upon the mantel. Lady Thornfield sat upright on the settee, the stiff lace at her collar a kind of fragile armor. Vivien, composed with visible effort, had taken a chair by the window where the failing light made of her profile a pale, classical thing. Captain Hartwell stood a little apart. Henry Ashford, who had removed his gloves before remembering that he had nowhere to put them, held them awkwardly and then, with a small apology, slipped them into his breast pocket. Alleyn did not occupy the center of the room. He placed himself near a side table where a small vase of bridal lilies had begun to brown at the edges. He spoke without preamble and without emphasis. Miss Diana died from cyanide, not in tablet or bottle, but extracted from the leaves of cherry laurel in the Conservatory. The bruised foliage is there to tell us so. The draught that killed her was not in the simple cup she used when she retreated to her pantry. It was in the Sèvres porcelain from the drawing-room tray. The fragment of her own cup is among the orchids. The ring of a vessel, no longer present, remains upon the library table. Her book was opened at random, though her ribbon marked another page. All this tells me that her final hour did not proceed according to her habit. He allowed the words to settle. The clock ticked with an almost ostentatious correctness. Someone, he continued, who knew her retreats and her small solaces, prepared Laurel, waited until Miss Diana had set her own tea aside, and then exchanged one cup for another. A clumsy securing of the French doors left scratches on the latch. The air moved. It disturbed the pages of Keats. It carried away, somewhat, the almond scent. Lady Thornfield's hands, folded tightly in her lap, did not stir. Sir Charles, who had not spoken since they entered, cleared his throat with painful restraint. Vivien's gaze fixed upon the lilies, as if their decline might be arrested by watching. "The letter," Alleyn said gently, addressed to a Bayswater direction that never belonged to Mr. Ashford, was posted by Miss Diana at 4. Its phrases bear marks of rehearsal. Some of its vocabulary is not entirely her own. A telegram later announced Mr. Ashford's intention to call. He did not send it. Such devices are useful in persuading a household that a young woman has resolved upon a particular course. Hartwell inclined his head a fraction, as if acknowledging a point neatly made. "Captain," Alleyn said, turning to him without severity, "you spoke with Miss Diana at the library door. Your advice, as you called it, left her pale but resolved. You inquired after the French latch with a convenience that is, in retrospect, rather too convenient. You possess, by habit and by training, the capacity to act neatly under pressure, and you have, I believe, a more intimate connection to those letters that should have remained private than Miss Diana imagined." Vivien's hand rose and fell a little upon the arm of her chair. Nothing more. The gesture might have been no more than a breath-catching. Hartwell looked not at Alleyn, but at Sir Charles. "I had hoped," he said quietly, "that the matter would be allowed to end with misapprehension." "The difficulty," Alleyn returned with the same grave civility, "is that habit gives one a language. Miss Diana's habit spoke with more authority than any letter. She would not, in despair, abandon the exactness with which she consoled herself. Neither would she choose the formal Sèvres for a private gesture, and the plant does not bruise itself." It was Henry Ashford who broke the silence, his voice quite steady. "Diana told me, without names, that she had been foolish, that letters existed which, if shown, would oblige where affection had not." Hartwell's face altered as if the skin had been drawn a shade tighter across the bone. "Miss Thornfield," he said, at last turning to Vivien, "I had no wish—" The sentence failed, not for lack of words, but for having too many of the wrong kind. Vivien rose. The motion was simple and unspectacular. She looked at Alleyn first, then at her mother, then at Hartwell. "Diana," she said very softly, "was always more honest than the rest of us." Lady Thornfield made a faint sound, not quite a sob. Sir Charles's hand went from mantle to pocket with the solemn economy of an old campaigner returning a sword to its scabbard. Hartwell's reply, when it came, was scarcely louder than the clock. It was meant to end the matter, to forestall scandal. She had threatened. No, forgive me. She had warned. I suggested the phrasing for the letter. I prepared the leaves. I told myself it would appear as she meant it to appear. That was the cowardice. There was no movement towards him, none away. The room, having received its truth, elected not to be surprised. Alleyn inclined his head, as if in answer to a point made with unassailable logic at dinner. "You will come with us presently, Captain. There's no need for spectacle. Meadows will arrange the car." Hartwell looked once at the garden and once at Vivien. Whatever passed in that exchange belonged to the part of life that is conducted without witnesses. He squared himself almost imperceptibly. "If Lady Thornfield permits," he said, "I should like a moment to write." "Of course," Lady Thornfield answered, the formality of the phrase covering 100 other sentences that would never be spoken. Alleyn moved to the door and stood aside. The lilies drooped more completely in their vase. Outside, the thin rain resumed with the diffident persistence of a servant who has returned, unnoticed, to his duties. The room, lighter by a secret, had grown immeasurably heavier. The next hour would belong to consequence, the one after to the quiet machinery of the law. Morning came to Thornfield with a washed light that made the lawns seem newly shorn of color, as though the rain had pared everything to essentials. The house, which had so lately arranged itself for celebration, now moved with the unhurried economy of grief. Florists' boys arrived at the tradesman's door and, under Mrs. Pembroke's direction, carried away baskets of lilies whose scent had grown oppressive. Meadows, with his habitual composure, saw to the quiet substitution of black-edged stationery upon Lady Thornfield's writing table. The Sèvres service, so fatally implicated, had been returned to its cabinet. The key now lay upon Alleyn's pocket-book. Captain Hartwell had passed the night in the small study off Sir Charles' library, attended by a uniformed constable whose presence was more symbol than necessity. At 7 o'clock, he asked leave to write 2 notes, one to his colonel, one to Miss Thornfield. Alleyn assented, watching, not unkindly, the steady hand that addressed the envelopes with that military precision which persists in men trained to control themselves when control has ceased to be of use. When Vivien came at Lady Thornfield's side, her face carried the translucence of one who has not slept. She stood just within the threshold, her hands clasped together so tightly that the knuckles showed white. Hartwell rose, bowed with formal correctness, and placed upon the table a small morocco case that had held a ring. "It appears," he said, and his voice was almost conversational, "that I must relieve you of an obligation others took for granted. I am sorry that my failure affects you." Vivien's lips moved, but whatever she had intended to say found no passage. She looked not at the case, but at Alleyn, and in that glance lay both appeal and acceptance. He inclined his head slightly, not as permission and not as denial, merely as recognition of a human moment that lay beyond the remit of charge sheets. Sir Charles entered then, grave and entirely present. He shook Hartwell's hand with the restraint of an Englishman who has learned that dignity can be maintained even in ruin. "You will find, Captain," he said, "that we shall say as little as possible to those who trade in calamity. Inspector Alleyn has our confidence." There was no confession in the theatrical sense. Marshalled out of him, perhaps, was a sequence of facts offered almost as a courtesy to the man who had perceived them. He had encountered Diana at the library doors. He had urged discretion where she had preferred candor. He had found the conservatory useful to his purpose. He did not plead love of Vivien, nor fear, nor debts. He offered motives as one might lay down cards already seen. "It was the appearance I depended upon," he said at last, and his eye moved almost absently to the French doors. She was so exact in her habits. I thought, if the cup were not hers, if the letter— He broke off with a shrug that was not an appeal to sympathy. It was not tidy. I see that now. Ashford, summoned to give his statement, had the honesty to look appalled rather than vindicated. Miss Vivien and I, he said to Alleyn in the morning room, were guilty of indiscretion and of nothing worse. We were young friends before this engagement was arranged. Diana, who loved plain speaking, thought concealment dishonest. She was wrong, perhaps in method, not in intention. He turned to Sir Charles with a respect that contained no supplication. I shall trouble the family no further, sir. If there is any imputation that touches me, Inspector, I shall meet it. There is none that concerns your honor, Alleyn said. You will be called at the inquest. Beyond that, I imagine your name will profit by silence. So it arranged itself. A discreet car from the local station took Hartwell away by the service drive. He did not resist the touch of the constable's hand upon his arm. Indeed, he thanked Meadows for his attentions of the night with an old-fashioned courtesy that made the butler's eyes smart unexpectedly. Lady Thornfield stood upon the step and inclined her head once, as one acknowledges a salute. Vivien did not come down. When the gravel had ceased its complaint beneath the tires, the house seemed to exhale. Mrs. Pembroke, with the instinct of long service, sent tea to the morning room. Meadows, having conferred with Sir Charles, went quietly to the small pantry off the library, and after a moment's pause, removed from the shelf the misplaced cup and set it straight. The gesture, trivial to any other eye, had about it the quality of a rite, habit restored, if not happiness. "Inspector," Sir Charles said when they were alone, "you have been considerate. One is grateful for skill, of course, but at such times one is grateful chiefly for manner." Alleyn inclined his head. "There will be formalities," he said gently. "They are necessary, but we shall conduct them with the least disturbance possible. Dr. Morrison will arrange for the coroner. You will be spared the worst of the public appetite." He found Vivien later in the conservatory, where the morning light made the cherry laurel's leaves gleam with an indifferent luster. She did not turn when he entered. "It seems," she said, speaking to the white bells, "that we were all managing appearances. Diana wanted truth. I wanted time." "Time," Alleyn said, "has its own ideas about being managed." He did not speak of forgiveness. The word has too sharp an edge when emotions are newly raw. "Miss Thornfield, if you can believe it, no one is improved by this. Not even the truth, which would have come by gentler means if we had had longer." She made a small sound that was not quite a sob. "Will they say it was my fault?" "They will say many things," Alleyn replied. "Most of them will pass. What remains will be what you can endure." In the afternoon, a wire arrived from Hartwell's colonel, formal, correct, sorrowing for the regiment's sake rather than the man's. The London papers asked questions which received no answers at Thornfield. The peacock, from some high perch among the yews, delivered its barbarous cry into the unlistening air. Justice, such as it was, had taken its course with the quiet inevitability that the law prefers. Irony, too, had claimed its share, a murder committed to guard a reputation that, exposed to daylight, might have come off with less damage than concealment contrived. There remained only the reckoning with absence, the place at table, the chair by the French doors, the book with its faded ribbon, each a simple testament that outlasts any verdict. By the second evening, Thornfield Manor had contrived to look once more like itself. The chandeliers were unlit. Lamps stood at a deliberate dimness. The footfalls of servants returned to their soft, unhurried rhythm. Even the rain, which had pattered faithfully through the affair, had washed the terraces into a pale gleam that suggested renewal without promising it. Alleyn walked with Sir Charles along the gravel path that led from the conservatory to the yew walk, Fox following at a discreet interval. The laurel, visible through the glass, made a white punctuation mark among the ferns and palms. "I shall have Timothy remove it," Sir Charles said, with the practicality that comes of old responsibilities. "As you wish," Alleyn replied. "It has its innocences too. The fault lay elsewhere." Sir Charles inclined his head, accepting both judgment and reprieve on behalf of a plant. "We shall be obliged to prune more than shrubs for a time," he said. "I cannot pretend my own arrangements were admirable. One persuades oneself that the young will do better if the old do not fail. Sometimes the persuasion is too persuasive." "Sometimes," Alleyn said. They walked in silence. In the distance, the peacock uttered its improper cry, and Sir Charles smiled without mirth. "The village will be kind," he added, with the weary exactness of a man accounting for known quantities. "The newspapers will be managed. It is Vivien I cannot calculate." "She will make her own sum," Alleyn said. "One must leave her the arithmetic." Sir Charles paused, drew a hand across his mouth, and offered thanks, formal, precise, and free of the vulgarity of gratitude. Alleyn bowed slightly, the conversation completed as thoroughly as Englishmen know how to complete what cannot be improved by talking. Inside, Meadows awaited them in the morning room with the gravity of a good servant arranging the behavior of a house. "Miss Vivien has gone upstairs, sir," he said to Sir Charles. "Dr. Whitmore read with her for a half-hour from St. John, at her request. She's resting now." Alleyn thought of the girl's steady gaze in the drawing-room, of the ring in its morocco case, and of the sudden unclenching of a life that had been braced too long against an inescapable shock. Tragedy, when it is properly proportioned, often produces a tidier mercy than happiness does. Fox, patient and unintrusive, offered his small harvest of tasks completed. The statements were signed, the exhibits sealed, transport arranged. "Very clean, sir," he said, meaning the paperwork. Alleyn nodded. "And not so clean," he added, "in the parts that matter." They went together to the library. The chair beside the French doors had been removed. The little table stood with its polished surface bare. Only the book remained, closed now, the ribbon resting where Diana had placed it on some other evening when solace had come easily. Alleyn picked it up, turned to the page marked by the embroidered D, and read a few lines without purpose. "Poetry has its own police court. It hears evidence very cheaply and returns verdicts that are almost always right for the wrong reason." He replaced the book and crossed to the conservatory. Timothy had begun his pruning with careful reluctance. The laurel's bruised leaves lay in a discreet heap, as if dead facts could be tidied by the same broom used for petals and dust. The air held less of almonds now and more of damp earth, which is healthier for houses and men. "Leave the stump," Alleyn said quietly. "Let the new growth be watched." Timothy touched his cap and vanished in that gentle way old gardeners have, as though they merely rearranged themselves among the plants. On his way back through the library, Alleyn paused at the doors. The latch required its trick, a slight lift, a half-inch draw inward, a downward turn governed by habit more than by thought. He performed the movement without looking, and the door closed with the note of satisfaction that materials give when used as they wish to be used. "Queer, sir," Fox observed, "how much of it came down to that. Habits. Habits make characters, and characters make crimes." Alleyn said, "When the two are in accord, it is simple. When they are not, it is interesting." They found Lady Thornfield in the morning room, with Vivien's empty teacup beside her, and Dr. Whitmore's little black book placed squarely upon a stack of now pointless wedding lists. There were a few quiet words of leave-taking. Lady Thornfield thanked them with a composure that she wore like a familiar shawl. It would keep out some of the cold and none of the winter. At the front steps, Meadows waited with Alleyn's hat. A gentle evening wind moved through the cedars and lifted the torn edge of a florist's bill that had escaped the waste-paper basket. It skittered across the stones, caught and lay still. As the motor car rolled down the drive, Fox glanced back. "They'll do," he said, meaning the house, the family, and something else besides. "They will manage," Alleyn answered. "Doing is for other people. They will manage." He looked ahead to the pale strip of road that led toward the station and, beyond that, to papers and rooms and men who would speak sharply and sleep heavily. Behind him, Thornfield settled the way a body settles around a mended bone. No longer quite as it was, not altogether unserviceable. He thought of the book's ribbon, of a cup set straight on a shelf, of a door that closed properly when handled as it required. Then he let the case go from his mind in the manner of a man laying down a pen at the end of a letter, knowing the signature will not improve what has been said. The peacock cried once more, insolently alive. The sound carried, thinned, and vanished into fields that kept their own counsel.